Something happens to people all over the world, in completely different places, at completely different times. They wake up in the middle of the night. They are conscious. They can see the room around them, but they cannot move. And that is when they see him. A tall figure, standing somewhere in the room, completely still, wearing what looks like a wide-brimmed hat. This is the beginning of what researchers and witnesses now call the hatman phenomenon. Most accounts begin the same way. A person wakes up suddenly during the night. Their body feels heavy, almost pinned in place. They try to speak, but nothing comes out. The room is dark, but not completely black. Just enough to make out shapes. And then, in a corner, or at the end of the bed, they notice something that should not be there. A silhouette, not moving, just watching. In many cases, people describe the figure as being unusually tall. Sometimes it feels like it is leaning slightly forward, as if observing them closely, without stepping any closer. There are no clear facial features, no sound, no footsteps, just presence and fear. Some witnesses later discover they were experiencing a state known as sleep paralysis, a condition where the mind wakes up before the body does. In this state, the brain can produce extremely vivid hallucinations that feel completely real. But what makes these reports strange is not just that people see something, it's what they all describe in almost the same way. A dark figure, a hat, and the feeling that it is aware of them. Over time, similar descriptions started appearing across different countries and cultures. People who had never heard of each other began reporting the same presence in nearly identical detail. In early online discussions and paranormal forums, these accounts started to cluster around one name: the Hatman. Some say he appears only in the darkest moments of sleep. Others insist they saw him while fully awake, standing in a hallway or doorway before vanishing without a trace. But regardless of the situation, the pattern is always the same: silence, stillness, and the sense that something is watching from just beyond the edge of the light. And for many people, the experience doesn't end when they wake up fully, because once you've seen something like that, the real question begins to form. Was it just a dream? Or did something actually stand there in the room with them? When people first describe seeing the Hatman, it often gets dismissed as a one-time hallucination linked to sleep paralysis. But as more accounts were collected over time, a different pattern began to emerge. It is not just that people see something once, it is that some people see it again, months later, years later, sometimes in completely different homes. And each time the experience follows a familiar structure. The person wakes up during the night, often unable to move, with the room feeling unusually heavy and silent. But in other cases, the experience happens while they are fully awake, usually in low light conditions, when the mind is tired and the environment is quiet. The figure is almost always described in the same way: a tall silhouette with a broad, dark hat, shape that seems to block out what little light is in the room. It does not rush or speak. It simply appears in a fixed position, as if it has already been there long before the person noticed. What makes these reports more unsettling is not just the appearance, but the consistency of placement. Many people describe it standing near doorways, corners of bedrooms, or at the foot of the bed. These are threshold areas, where visibility is partial and the brain has to fill in missing detail. In neurological terms, this is where the mind is most likely to misinterpret shapes during moments of fear or exhaustion. But even that explanation does not fully account for the emotional intensity described in these encounters. Witnesses often report an immediate sense of dread that arrives before they are even fully aware of what they are seeing. As online forums began to grow in the early 2000s, more people started sharing their experiences publicly. What stood out was not just the number of reports, but how similar the language was. even when the individuals had no connection to each other. The same descriptions of height, posture, silence, and the distinct hat shape kept appearing again and again. Some accounts added another layer, a feeling of awareness, not just that the figure was present, but that it was aware of the person observing it. This detail appears repeatedly across unrelated testimonies, making it one of the most discussed aspects of the phenomenon. In some cases, people describe the experience lasting only a few seconds before the figure fades or disappears as soon as they regain movement. In others, they report the figure remaining completely still until they manage to turn on a light or fully wake themselves up, at which point it is no longer there. Despite the differences in setting, timing, and personal background, the structure of the encounter remains consistent enough that it began to be treated as a pattern rather than isolated incidents. And as more stories accumulated, a question began to form among researchers and observers of paranormal reports. If so many people are seeing the same figure, in different places, under different conditions, why does it always take the same form when it appears? As more accounts continued to surface, researchers and paranormal writers began to notice that the hatman phenomenon did not stay confined to one type of experience. While sleep paralysis remained the most commonly reported trigger, there were increasing descriptions that did not fit neatly into that explanation. Some people insisted they were fully awake, moving around their homes when the experience occurred. Others described seeing the figure briefly while walking through dimly lit hallways or passing through doorways at night. In these cases, the encounter was often described as sudden, almost like noticing something that had already been standing there for an unknown amount of time. What remains consistent across these variations is the emotional reaction. Witnesses frequently describe an immediate drop in comfort or safety, even before they fully register what they are seeing. This response often comes in the form of a sudden silence in the mind, a sense that the environment has changed in a way that is difficult to explain. Over time, comparisons were made between hatman reports and older folklore describing shadow entities. Many cultures have long histories of stories involving dark, human-like figures appearing at night, often associated with fear, illness, or transitional states between sleep and wakefulness. These older narratives do not use modern terminology, but the described forms share noticeable similarities with contemporary accounts. In modern discussions, the hatman is often grouped with what are broadly called shadow people. These are reported as humanoid silhouettes seen in peripheral vision or in low light conditions. However, the hatman stands out in these descriptions because of a specific and repeated feature that distinguishes it from more general shadow figures: the defined shape of a hat, which appears unusually consistent across unrelated reports. Another recurring detail is the way the figure seems to interact with space. Witnesses often describe it as not blending into the environment like a shadow would, but instead occupying it as a solid presence. It does not cast light, but it is also not described as completely flat or two-dimensional. This contradiction is part of what makes the reports so difficult to categorize. In some cases, individuals report that the figure appears closer after they blink or briefly lose focus, as if its position has shifted without visible movement. Others describe the opposite, where the figure remains perfectly still but seems to become more defined the longer it is observed. As these patterns were compiled from different regions and time periods, the consistency became harder to ignore. The accounts did not rely on a single cultural background or shared belief system. They appeared in different countries, different languages, and among people who had no prior knowledge of the phenomenon before their experience. This raised a broader question among those studying the reports. If the hatman is not tied to one culture, one location, or one type of sleep state, then why does the description remain so specific, even when the circumstances change? As interest in the hatman grew, more detailed collections of accounts began to appear in online archives and paranormal discussions. What became especially notable was that some people described not just a single encounter, but a recurring presence that seemed to follow a pattern over time. In these longer-term reports, individuals often describe the first sighting as the most intense. After that, later encounters tend to shift in character. Instead of appearing directly in the room, the figure is sometimes reported at a distance, such as at the end of a hallway or partially obscured by a doorway. In a smaller number of accounts, people claim the presence becomes less visually distinct over time, but still strongly felt. Another repeated detail involves the environment itself. Many witnesses describe a change in atmosphere before the figure appears. This is often reported as a sudden stillness, where normal background sounds feel muted or absent. Some describe a sensation of pressure in the room, as if the space has become heavier or more confined than before. While interpretations vary widely, some researchers have suggested that these experiences may be connected to how the brain processes fear during disrupted sleep cycles. During transitions between wakefulness and dreaming, the mind can generate extremely vivid imagery that feels external and real. In these states, the brain can also heighten threat perception, which may explain why many reports involve an immediate sense of danger or unease. However, even within that framework, the hatman remains unusual because of how consistently it is described across unrelated individuals. The combination of height, posture, dark silhouette, and hat-like shape appears with a level of repetition that is not commonly seen in other reported sleep-related hallucinations. In parallel, cultural analysis of the phenomenon has pointed out that similar dark watcher figures appear in older historical accounts, long before modern sleep science or internet communities existed. These older descriptions vary in detail, but often include themes of silent observation, nighttime appearances, and a sense of being watched without interaction. But what makes the modern hatman reports distinct is the level of detail consistency, especially in recent decades, where communication between witnesses has become easier. As more people share their experiences publicly, the descriptions begin to converge, reinforcing a shared image of the figure even among those who initially had no prior exposure to it. Despite attempts to categorize the phenomenon, it remains unclear whether these similarities come from shared neurological experiences, cultural reinforcement, or something that has yet to be fully understood. And as the compiled reports continued to grow, one question began to appear more frequently than any other. If the experience can be explained through the mind alone, why do so many people describe it as if it is the same presence returning again and again across completely separate lives? Across the most recent collections of hatman accounts, a final pattern appears that ties many of the stories together. It is not about where the figure shows up or even how often it appears, but what people say happens immediately after the experience ends. Many witnesses describe a lingering sense of awareness that continues after the figure disappears. Even when they are fully awake, able to move again, and the room returns to normal, there is often a persistent feeling that something is still present nearby. This sensation usually fades with time, but in some cases, people report it returning during later nights, especially in low light or moments of exhaustion. In sleep research, episodes like these are often associated with the way the brain transitions between dreaming and waking states. During these transitions, the mind can temporarily misinterpret internal signals as external reality, creating highly structured and memorable experiences. This can include the perception of figures, voices, or presences that feel fully real at the time. What continues to make the hatman phenomenon stand out, however, is not just the experience itself, but how it is remembered. People consistently describe the encounter as clearer and more detailed than most dreams, often recalling the exact position, shape, and feeling of the figure even years later. This level of recall is one reason the reports have remained so persistent in online communities and discussions over time. As the stories accumulated, the Hatman became less of a single ghost sighting and more of a shared cultural image that appears across different regions and generations. Some see it as a neurological event, others as a modern myth, shaped by repetition and storytelling. Neither explanation fully removes the intensity of the experience for those who report it. What remains consistent is the structure of the encounter itself: a sudden awareness during the night, a silent presence in the room, a figure that does not interact, but is strongly felt, and an ending that leaves more questions than answers. In the end, the Hatman phenomenon sits in a space between interpretation and experience. It exists in the overlap between sleep, perception, and fear, where the mind is most vulnerable to creating something that feels undeniably real. And whether it is a trick of the brain, a shared psychological pattern, or something still not fully understood, the reports continue to appear in the same form, from people who have never met in places far apart, all describing the same silent figure in the dark.